Hey guys, how's it going? So UFC 315 is this weekend and I'm going to run through the card and give you guys all my picks and predictions for this event, so let's just jump straight into it. Opening up the card on the early prelims is Brad Katona versus Bekzat Almakhan. So Brad Katona, most recently coming off a fight against G Matsumoto, which he lost, which was really close. But I just think Matsumoto landed the better shots that fight, and you know, Matsumoto has a tendency to make all of his fights really competitive. And he ended up just taking that one. Before that, he fought Jesse Butler, who I don't think is an amazing opponent. He got cut after losing to Katona and also Jim Miller. And before that, he had a very competitive fight again against Garrett Armfield, where he got outstruck pretty badly on the feet, but evened it out decently with his wrestling. But overall, it's very rare we see Katona absolutely dominate someone in a fight, so it's gonna probably go to a decision. Bekzat Almakhan has had a really rough run in the UFC. His first ever opponent in the UFC was Umar Nurmagomedov, which is a rough start. And he just got dominated in all three rounds of that fight. He got held down, out-wrestled, pretty much a way you would imagine a fight against someone who's completely unranked and Umar Nurmagomedov, the cousin of Khabib, to go. He did almost knock Umar out in the first round. His striking's actually pretty good. On the regional scene, he has some very good wins via finishes on the feet and TKOs. But yeah, in that fight, he landed an overhand within the opening seconds of the fight that dazed and wobbled Umar, and if he could follow up, would have had him out. He couldn't end up doing it and ended up losing a decision, but that was very close. And I think Almakhan's very underrated, so I'm going to go with him this fight, and I'm going to say that he's going to take it by decision. Next up is Daniel Santos versus Jeongyeong Lee. So Daniel Santos, he's stepping up somewhat late notice as a replacement opponent for this fight, with his previous fight, which was a couple weeks ago, being cancelled, so I'm not too worried about that. I think he has been training. His last actual fight was against Johnny Munoz, where he had a pretty good performance. He looked significantly better on the feet and even dominated a bit in the ground later in the fight. He also presents a finishing threat. He put away John Castaneda in the second round when they fought, which was a pretty even fight leading up to the finish, with Castaneda's wrestling being the real threat that fight. But putting away Castaneda is pretty impressive. He's a pretty tricky guy and can take quite a bit of punishment. Earlier in his career, he did get beat up pretty badly by Julio Arce when they fought, but Julio Arce is a pretty good striker, and I think Santos' striking has drastically improved since then. Jeongyeong Lee, he got beat up and finished in the first round when he fought Hyder Emil recently, which is pretty bad, but Hyder Emil's a pretty impressive fighter. He's incredibly dangerous on the feet, and he is an up-and-coming prospect. He's 3-0 in the UFC and has won all his fights very convincingly. Before that, he had a very low volume fight with Blake Builder, where he won the decision mainly through his takedowns and wrestling in the second and third rounds of that fight, but it wasn't an amazing performance. And his wrestling might not be as big of a threat as that fight would lead on, because in his first ever fight in the UFC, he went to a close split decision where he got out wrestled and only really won through his striking. But I don't think it's going to be enough. I think Daniel Santos' striking is significantly better than Lee's, and I don't think his wrestling is going to be enough to take him through the fight, so I'm going to go with Daniel Santos by around 3 KO for this one. Next up on the card is Marc-Andre Barriault versus Bruno Silva. So Barriault most recently got beat up and knocked out by Justin Stoltzfus, who isn't really an amazing opponent and doesn't really get finishes on anyone. So the fact that he finished Barriault very quickly in his fight is kind of concerning. Before that, he didn't land a single shot, got beat up and knocked out by Joe Pyfer really badly at UFC 303. That was in the opening minutes of the first round. And he does every now and then occasionally get a win, with a very impressive performance over Eric Anders when they fought, but it was a pretty competitive fight, with Barriault just doing a bit better in the striking. But for every one of his fights that he wins by decision, he loses another 2, most likely through being put away. So it is kind of concerning going into this fight. His opponent, Bruno Silva, also a pretty shocking record within the UFC, with him recently being on a 4-fight losing streak, granted against pretty decent opponents. Most recently, he lost to Ismail Nurdiev in a fight where he was getting edged down the feet and lost mainly through Nurdiev mixing in these takedowns and wrestling. He also had a fight against Shara Bullet, which was actually one of the closer fights, where he used his wrestling to make Shara look like less of a threat that whole fight. But either way, he lost that one as well. He also had an occasional impressive finish, with his first round KO over Brad Tavares standing out the most. He made quick work of Brad in that fight and knocked him out pretty flush, so that was pretty impressive against someone as good as Brad Tavares. But overall, I just think he presents a bigger threat on the feet than Barriault, and Barriault is way too easy to put away. And I can see that happening here, like the numerous times it has happened throughout Barriault's career. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Bruno Silva by round 2 KO for this one. And now we move on to the prelims. Navajo Stirling takes on Ivan Erslan. So Navajo Stirling, probably best known for training at City Kickboxing with Izzy, Hooker, Kaikara France, those lot. And after his knockout in the Contender Series, a lot of people were thinking he was going to be the next big thing to come out of that gym. But he got signed to the UFC, and in his first fight with Tuco Tokos, he wasn't able to find a finish in that fight or put a statement on that fight at all, really, which made a lot of people sort of lose stock in him. But either way, it was a one-way traffic performance from Stirling in that fight, where he absolutely beat up on Tokos. But at times, it did look like there were sort of holes in his game, as his style sort of slowed down dramatically and he wasn't really able to present as much domination as he usually does, but still a good win nonetheless. Ivan Erslan also only one fight within the UFC, where he kind of got thrown in the deep end, being matched up with Cutelaba, who's a pretty tricky opponent. Regardless, he took Cutelaba to a very close split decision, in which he came up just short in the third round, ultimately leading to Cutelaba winning the fight primarily through his wrestling. But this was a pretty tricky matchup, and even this one is pretty hard to pick for, because I do think that Stirling looked a lot more dominant in his UFC fight against Erslan, but granted, against sort of a worse opponent in my opinion. But I do think he did look better overall. I didn't think Erslan looked especially amazing when he fought Cutelaba, even though it was Cutelaba. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with Navajo Stirling by a round 3 knockout. Next up on the card is Modestas Bukauskas versus Ion Cutelaba. So Modestas Bukauskas, he looked very impressive in his most recent fight against Rafael Cerquiera, where he made quick work of him. He knocked him out badly in the middle of that first round and put his lights out cold. He looked a little less impressive when taking on Marcin Prachinio at UFC 304, where he was sort of getting beat on the feet, but in the second and third round used his wrestling to make it a bit more competitive. And then in the third round he found a submission, took it and finished the fight that way. Before that, he did get beat up pretty badly by Vitor Petrino, who isn't an amazing opponent. It's not like he's like the next competitor at light heavyweight, but yeah, and in that fight, he did get wrestled in the first and second round and then got finished badly in that second. So yeah, there's that. Ion Cutelaba had a pretty big upset win over Ibo Aslan, where after some even striking, he took Aslan down and submitted him with relative ease. And in that fight, a lot of people thought that he'd succumb to the Turkish power of Ibo Aslan and get finished within maybe even one round. But he pulled off that upset. Before that, he had a bit of an unimpressive performance against Ivan Erslan that went to a pretty close split decision, where he just took it through his wrestling in the second and third round. And before that, he lost pretty badly to Felipe Lins in a fight where he got outstruck and didn't really seem to have much success in the wrestling, as he usually does. He got out-wrestled in the second and third, and that's how he ultimately lost that fight. Overall, this is a really hard fight to pick for. Both these fighters are pretty evenly matched, with the odds sort of reflecting that. But I'm gonna go with Modestas Bukauskas. Primarily, I just think his striking's better than Cutelaba's, and he can really defend anything wrestling-wise that Cutelaba throws at him. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Modestas Bukauskas by round 2 KO. Next up is Jessica Andrade versus Jasmine Jasudavicius. So Jessica Andrade, most recently she lost to Natalia Silva in a pretty fun scrappy fight where Silva absolutely outlanded her on the feet, with Andrade landing some really impactful punches every now and then, but ultimately it was Silva that outvolumed her way to a decision win that fight. Before that, she had a very close split decision over Marina Rodriguez, where she ultimately won through landing these big powerful shots that she was really sitting down on occasionally throughout the fight. But she was sort of struggling with the fast peppery jabs and combos of Rodriguez, where she was getting out-volumed at certain points. But it's evident her best weapon is her power in her hands with these power shots she throws, with her having a really nice big knockout over Mackenzie Dern in their fight at UFC 295, where she managed to put Mackenzie Dern out pretty badly in the second round. So yeah, Jasmine Jasudavicius took a pretty good decision win in her most recent fight against Bruno Silva, where she dominated on the ground as usual, but also beat up pretty badly on the feet, with Silva not really putting up much defense though. She didn't look great that fight, but regardless, Jasudavicius was teeing off on Silva's head. Outside of that, she took another win, this time by third round submission when she fought Ariane da Silva, in a fight where she looked way more dominant and took a performance of the night bonus for that one. And even before that, she had a decently close fight with Fatima Klein where it was decently close on the feet, but ultimately what won her the fight was her wrestling. And while I don't think Jasudavicius has taken on someone as dangerous on the feet as Jessica Andrade, and she's going to have to be incredibly careful this one not to get finished on the feet, I do think though that she will be able to neutralize any striking threat through her wrestling this fight and take it all the way to a decision without getting put away on the feet. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with Jasmine Jasudavicius by a decision win. And closing out the prelims, we have Mike Malott versus Charles Radtke. So Mike Malott recently shown improvements in his most recent fight against Trevin Giles, where he looked the best he has yet on the feet and really stood his own ground against Giles, who's made it pretty close and competitive with the likes of DDP and Carlos Prates. He's no joke on the feet. Malott's also a pretty competent wrestler. In his fight with Adam Fugit, he mixed in takedowns and wrestling to win that first round, and then he knocked down Fugit in the second and submitted him pretty easily, and he got a performance of the night bonus for that one as well. Every time I start to think of Malott being a dominant champ within the division, not champ, but just a dominant contender or a dominant force even, I just get flashbacks back to that Neil Magny fight where he was winning the whole fight, and then just in the closing seconds when Magny got top mount, just absolutely just gave up and wilted into sort of this ground and pound that Magny was throwing at him. He curled up, folded over, stopped defending himself and threw away that fight. So there is that sort of mental block going into this one. Charles Radtke coming off a knockout over Matthew Semmelsberger in the first minute of the first round, which is very impressive, but Semmelsberger isn't all that. He has a pretty iffy record and I don't really think he's a real contender. Before that, he got finished with a body shot TKO from Carlos Prates, with Prates pretty much being in control that whole fight. Radtke didn't really present much adversity before getting finished, so yeah, but I think that was mainly just Prates. Prates is very, very good despite what happened to him recently. I think he is one of the better welterweights, so that was a rough one. He did get another first round finish in the closing moments of the round when he took on Gilbert Urbina, knocking him down and then putting him away with a KO. So I do think that despite his loss to Prates, he is on a hot streak at the moment and he has some of the sort of better striking and even a better resume than Malott in my opinion. So I think his striking's going to take him through this and I think he is very dangerous on the feet. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Charles Radtke by round 2 KO. And opening up the main card, we have Benoit Saint-Denis versus Karl Prepolek. So this was originally supposed to be Benoit Saint-Denis versus Yoel Alvarez, which I thought was probably one of the best matchups on the card. That fell through. Alvarez is out with an injury. Prepolek stepped up. So Saint-Denis, he's recently been fraud checked pretty badly twice. With his most recent one coming over Renato Moicano, where he just got beat up. It was an absolute one-way beating the minute it got to the ground, which was very quickly. And Moicano was just landing these elbows and shots from above that were cutting Benoit open and causing a lot of swelling on his face. And then in the second round after he survived pretty much, the doctors came in, stopped the fight. He lost that one. Before that, he lost to Dustin Poirier in a fight that I thought was incredibly high level for him. He was 12th at the time, and I think Poirier was something like 4th. It was a pretty high jump up, and he got knocked out by a brutal right hook from Poirier in the second round. However, people did say that the staph infection he had was sort of playing a role. He did look a lot slower, he wasn't throwing as much, and what he was throwing didn't land with as much power as we usually see. And he kept his hands like down for most of the fight. He wasn't defending much either. It looked like his cardio just tanked the minute they stepped into the ring. Before that, he was a formidable opponent in the lightweight division. He was on a 5-fight win streak, all of which ended in finishes, both knockouts and submissions. And he topped that off with a brutal head kick KO over Matt Frivola, which kind of got him this Poirier fight. That was in the first round, brutal knockout, one-way beatdown before that. So there are remnants of a really formidable foe in Benoit Saint-Denis. Karl Prepolek, originally meant to be Yoel Alvarez in this fight, as I said. So he's stepping up on a week's notice to fill in which is kind of dodgy, but all signs are really pointing to Prepolek losing this fight. Not only is it late notice step up, but it's also, he hasn't fought since 2019, and he lost both his fights. He lost to Austin Hubbard, where he won the first through striking, but then proceeded just to get pulled down to the ground and beat up. And then even before that, he lost to Nordin Talib, which he got outstruck all 3 rounds in a fight that, you know, it's not a Benoit Saint-Denis. And overall, I just think this is a layout for Saint-Denis. He's really dangerous despite his last 2 performances, and we saw a bit of that in the Moicano fight, but I think he's just going to beat up on Prepolek. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with Benoit Saint-Denis by round 1 knockout. Next up, we have Alexa Grasso versus Natalia Silva. So Alexa Grasso, she's now an ex-champion of the women's flyweight division. She lost her belt to Valentina Shevchenko at UFC 306 at the Sphere, and in this fight, it was not very eventful, to put it bluntly. It was very, very boring. There was only 55 significant strikes thrown by both fighters over the duration of a 5-round fight, which is crazy. Shevchenko took Grasso down pretty much every round and just held her there, and that's how she won that fight. Grasso had moments. She did present a bit of a submission threat at different times in the fight, and on the feet she actually looked pretty good, but we didn't see much of that, and she ended up losing the belt. Back in her original fight with Shevchenko that actually won her the belt, she looked a lot better on the feet. She got a bit of time to actually show her striking, and then even on the ground, even though she was getting taken down quite a bit, she got taken down twice in round 2 and 3. But in the 4th round, she was able to present this submission threat. She found a rear naked choke and locked it in very, very tight and took the belt of Shevchenko. But I do think her striking is quite good. Outside of her trilogy with Shevchenko, she demonstrated her striking prowess against Viviane Araújo, where in the early rounds she looked very dominant on the feet. She made it a bit closer in the later rounds, but in the first 3, she looked very, very good. So there is still that striking threat present, I think. Natalia Silva, undefeated in the UFC with no real sign of slowing down. Her most recent fight was against Jessica Andrade, who is pretty high level competition, and that was a very scrappy brawl on the feet in what I think is Andrade's strongest area. She's very powerful with the hands, she's very good at striking, and you don't really want to stand with her. But Silva ended up doing that and doubling her volume, and Andrade lost that one by a pretty dominant decision loss, with Natalia Silva looking very good that fight. She had a slightly less dominant performance against Viviane Araújo, where, despite having decent takedown defense, she defended quite a few of them. Whenever Araújo would take her down, she'd just sort of lay there and not really have an answer to it. But I think for most of her opponents in the UFC, her striking has been enough historically to get it done, especially with those 3-rounders. She can win most of the time convincingly just through the striking, as was the case with Andrea Lee back at UFC 292. And I think this is a trend we'll continue to see in her UFC fights. And while I do think Grasso does present somewhat of a grappling threat, I don't really see it being enough to end the fight with Silva. I think her takedown defense is pretty good, and on the ground she can hold her own decently. But overall, I just think the striking from Natalia Silva is a bit better than Alexa Grasso, so I think that I'm going to have to go with her just by out-voluming Grasso. So I'm going to go with Natalia Silva by a decision win. Next up, we have Jose Aldo versus Ayman Zahabi. So, Jose Aldo, one of the featherweight greats, one of the featherweight champions, one of the few. He had an incredible resume in that division before having the belt taken off him by Max Holloway when they fought, but he was one of the greats in featherweight. There's only been very few. But now he's making another run in the UFC at bantamweight, where he's had a pretty on and off record, if we're being honest, but he has been put up against some of the best in that division. In his first bantamweight run in the UFC, it came to an end and he retired after a loss to Merab Dvalishvili, causing him to sort of get out of the game for a bit. He had that retirement ceremony. But this was a very competitive fight, with Aldo being able to deny all 16 takedown attempts from Merab, which is something we haven't even been close to seeing. And we now know how good Merab's wrestling is with time, and I think he has had one of the closest fights with a very dangerous Merab, so he definitely still has it. After retiring, he came back at UFC 301, where he put on an amazing performance over Jonathan Martinez, who is a very competent striker with his ability to chop away at his opponent's leg, causing most of his fights to finish early. But Aldo came back and he did it in a style where it looked like he never went away. He absolutely sort of outclassed Martinez. But recently he is coming over a loss over Mario Batista in a match that I thought he was getting robbed. I can't believe they even made that matchup, kind of underselling Jose Aldo's legacy in the first place, but he just got held up against the cage in the 3rd round, which was the swing round in that fight, and ultimately Batista took it. Not an impressive performance from Batista, and Aldo really didn't get a chance to show himself in that fight, so I don't credit that one too much. Ayman Zahabi had a decently close striking battle with Pedro Munoz recently, where he took the first 2 rounds before sort of getting beat in the third. But ultimately, he took that decision over a very competent veteran in the division. He had another pretty close fight with Javid Basharat, who at the time was coming up and within that division was sort of making his way to the top 15 spot, with Zahabi winning the decision for looking just better on the feet consistently that fight. He also does have some finishes on his record with his first round knockout over Araqualing, where he knocked him out pretty badly in the first minute of the first round. That was a very quick fight and we didn't really get to see much from Araqualing that fight. But as he fights higher and higher level competition, I think this finishing ability has definitely disappeared from Zahabi's fighting, and it's become a lot more technical. And I think his striking, while decent, I don't think it has anything against Jose Aldo, and I think he's going to hit a wall with how good Jose Aldo is, how technical he is, how experienced he is, and I just see him getting out-volumed to a decision. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with Jose Aldo by a decision win. And now the co-main event for the Women's Flyweight Championship, Valentina Shevchenko versus Manon Fiorot. So Shevchenko, as stated before, most recently coming off a win over Alexa Grasso, where she won the belt back after that trilogy. Pretty boring fight, 5 rounds, very dull, nothing much happened, didn't really prove anything in that fight. However, she did have a pretty dominant reign as the women's flyweight champ when she first held the belt before getting it taken from her, showing both on the feet and in the grappling she could definitely hold her own. In fact, she kind of dominated in most cases, especially in the case with Talia Santos, where she looked a lot better throughout the fight, both on the striking and also when it got taken to the ground. She'd mix in takedowns and just push all the cards in her favour in the end. She also had some finishing potential with her fight against Lauren Murphy being not just a 4th round TKO, but just prior to that a complete beatdown and a demolishing and a complete wilting from Murphy, in which she just looked absolutely dominant. Overall, the real question is in this matchup is whether Shevchenko can hold on to this performance that she had so long ago, and whether she's still got it in her to go on a second title run, with her most recent performance over Grasso not looking too promising. Manon Fiorot undefeated in her 7 UFC fights, which is pretty impressive, and she has some very nasty finishes very early in her career, especially one over Tabitha Ricci, where she absolutely beat up on Ricci, and then when it got to the cage, she just kept beating on her. Ricci turned around, covered up. The ref had to jump in and stop it, and Fiorot just has some really relentless striking. Recently, she's been keeping the same performances and sort of getting wins over very impressive opponents. Erin Blanchfield jumps to mind in a fight where she won all 5 rounds on the feet, and it really only got close through the wrestling, but Manon Fiorot did look really good as well in the wrestling, which is usually Blanchfield's strong suit. And even in her fights where she doesn't really land more than her opponents, the power she puts out every punch and the way she sits down on her punches is a very convincing argument for the judges, where she wins most striking exchanges just based on power. It was the case with the Rose Namajunas fight, where she did actually get out-volumed, but every fight that she did land, she sat down a bit more on it and it did a bit more damage, and overall she took that one by decision. When it comes down to it, I just don't think I can trust Shevchenko to come back to her old vintage performances, especially after that most recent performance and against someone as hard-hitting and dangerous as Manon Fiorot. I just don't see her being as dominant as she used to be. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Manon Fiorot, and I'm going to say she's going to get this one done by a decision win. And now the main event, Belal Muhammad takes on Jack Della Maddalena for the UFC Welterweight Championship of the World. Prepare for some glaze. Belal Muhammad most recently separated Leon Edwards from his belt in a fight that not many people will admit, but it is true. He bullied Leon Edwards and made him quit very early in that fight, dominating him on the ground and even later in the round piecing him up on the feet as well, with Leon just looking like he'd given up midway through the fight, and he didn't really do anything promising in those later rounds. It felt like after round 3 he knew he was going to lose on the card, so he just gave up. Before that, he got his title shot against Gilbert Burns in a fight where he beat up on Burns on the feet, as well as denying any real takedown attempts that Burns was trying to land and utilize his grappling through. And he took that one to a decision. Very smart performance. He neutralized Burns' best weapon in that fight, which was his BJJ, even though Muhammad's very good at wrestling. Burns' biggest threat in that fight was locking in a submission on the ground, which Belal didn't even want to sort of entertain. He also has a TKO finish over Sean Brady, who I think is really, really good, in a fight where the first round was fairly even striking-wise, but the second he absolutely picked up the pace on Brady, pushed him up against the cage, and just started teeing off on him, causing him to cover up and be cut open, and just look weak and defeated, and ultimately the ref jumped in the second round and finished that fight by TKO. Overall, he's a very skilled fighter in all areas, with his best weapon being his grappling, but he can also hold his own very decently in the striking, and I think a lot of people underrate how decent he is in that striking department. He's not going to get any finishes, but he will win the fight convincingly through volume or through dominant positioning, and the scorecards are always good towards him. Jack Della Maddalena, yeah, had an incredible comeback against Gilbert Burns at UFC 299 with the knowledge that he'd broken his forearm afterwards, making this fight even more impressive and incredible. He broke his arm very early in the first, with Gilbert Burns kicking him in the arm while he was holding up a guard, split his, I think it was ulna or radius, ulna, in half, and later in the fight, when he landed this very clean knee down the middle in the third round, he gets Gilbert on the ground for a TKO, and he starts posturing up with the arm that he has broken. And I think this just demonstrates overall just his grit and how he's not going to quit in a fight and wilt under pressure. He's going to stick it out even through the worst circumstances. And this was a fight that Gilbert was winning the first 2 rounds very, 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 very convincingly. But Jack Della, he reverses, knees him straight down the middle, and just sees blood in the water and just goes for the finish. Got it. Very, very good performance. Before that, he had a very close fight with Kevin Holland, which went to a split decision that JDM took predominantly off landing the harder punches and landing the cleaner combos, with Holland landing these one-off shots that weren't really doing much. But it could be argued that Holland won based off volume, but I think that one was pretty obvious for Della Maddalena. But before that, he had an absolute brawl with Randy Brown, who we've seen recently is a very, very good welterweight. What he did to Nicholas Dalby was no joke, but in this fight, JDM absolutely beat up on him on the feet, and then he knocked him down and then just instantly jumped on his back and submitted him within the first 2 minutes of that first round. Very, very dominant performance over a very dangerous welterweight, and during the lead up to this fight, Belal's just convinced me that he's not going to win this fight. He's been constantly saying that he's going to stand. He has Canelo hands. He's going to try and outbox Jack Della. We're not going to do a single takedown, he's even said. But one, I think that's a lie. I think he's going to try and shoot takedowns at some point in this fight. And two, even if he does try and outstrike JDM, JDM's not going to wilt under the pressure like most of Belal's opponents have. And I don't even think he'll let Belal get him up against the cage. He's very good at counter-punching, and he knows when he can come in and attack. And even still, I think JDM is a very dominant threat on the ground. In that Gilbert fight, he wasn't getting submitted or anything. He was losing, but on the ground, he can defend his own. He can roll out of positions very well. So even if it does go to the ground, I think JDM will put up a very decent fight. And on the feet, I think it's just going to be day and night. JDM has one of the best finishing instincts in the UFC, and we've seen Belal falter at moments, and I can't see JDM not taking this opportunity to chase down a finish. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with JDM by around 4 KO. Glaze, glaze, glaze. Yes, I get it. So that's it, guys. That was UFC 315. Right now on the screen are all my picks, all of Cameron's picks for this event. This event is pretty decent. It's not like a UFC 314 or anything, but it is very fun. And the main event, I mean, I can't pretend. I'm very excited to see a Perth guy potentially have a chance to win the belt. We saw it with Steve Erceg, and in that fight, I was like freaking out. Hopefully JDM can get it done, bring a belt back to Perth. Let's go. Yeah, not much else to say about this one. Let's go JDM. Let's go. Bye-bye.